Abraham did not get any children. He wanted to help God, fulfilling the promise of an heir. Sarah, his wife, wanted that too, so he went to him with her maid Hagar and asked Abraham to sleep with her and get a child. The story is told in Genesis 16, and it is told also in verse 2. Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. That is the translation from New International Version. In Hebrew, Abraham listened to his wife's voice. And the reader of Genesis would know that is not good, because the exact same expression has been used once before in Genesis 3, after the fall in the Garden of Eden, when God speaks to Adam in verse 17 and said, because you listened to your wife, that is, listened to the voice of your wife. I'm not saying that you should not listen to the voice of your wife, but in this case, it is one of the many examples of the art of suggestion you find in Genesis. Welcome to the second extra tidbit from Genesis. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and we're looking at ways in which Genesis, by small expressions or situations, repeating these, point back to situations that have been discussed before, and by that enhances our understanding of the text. Let's go to another example. In chapter 22, Abraham is asked by God to go to Mount Moriah and sacrifice his son Isaac. In that case, he doesn't say anything to Sarah. In verse 3, it is said, early the next morning. That is a simple expression, but exactly the same expression is used in the previous chapter in verse 14, early next morning. In that case, it was used in connection with the event where Abraham sends away, on Sarah's suggestion, sends away Hagar and Ishmael to exclude Ishmael from potential heritage. And if you read through, you will find that there are a number of similarities, linguistic similarities, between these two accounts, one where Abraham sends Ishmael away and one where he's going to Moriah to sacrifice his now only son, Isaac. And if you want to see more of these similarities, look up Dr. Chukang Dukang's commentary on Genesis. In chapter 32, we have one of the climaxes in the book of Genesis. Jacob fights, struggles with a mysterious person who turns out to be God himself in chapter 32. And in the midst of that conversation, the man asked him, verse 27, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Why this outcome? Because this dialogue is a reminder of a previous dialogue that Jacob had with his aging father Isaac, where Jacob pretended to be Esau and his blind father did not see who he was. Now Jacob is unable to see who the man was with whom he was fighting. And in that situation, Isaac asked Jacob, "What is your name?" And Jacob said, deceiving his father, he said, "I am Esau." Now, when God asks the question, "What is your name?" Jacob answers in honesty, in acknowledgement, "I'm Jacob. I'm a deceiver." And when he acknowledged that, God gave him the new name, "You have been victorious, Israel." This is a question of identity. And the two situations show together how Jacob developed. In Genesis 50, let's turn towards the end of the book. In Genesis 50, the patriarch Jacob has died. And the brothers of Joseph become afraid that Joseph still harbors revengeful thoughts against them. So they turn to him and they tell him, "We will be your slaves," in verse 18 in chapter 50. And then Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." The expression, "Am I in the place of God?" has been used once before in chapter 30, verse 2. That is the situation where the wives of Jacob are fighting for the honor of getting children. And Rachel is unable to bear any children, and she goes to Jacob and she complains. And we can read it this way in chapter 30. When Rachel, verse 1, saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister, so she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?" Now this seems to be a more negative story, but the point is that Jacob tells her, "This is something God has done. I'm not in charge." And Joseph tells his brother the same. It's not up to me to change or try to change what God has decided. God has decided that the harm, the evil you did to me should be turned to something good, and that is what I stand by. He's exercising grace. In the text in chapter 50, verse 19, you also have a hint, a suggestion back to chapter 44, verse 4. That's a situation where Joseph sends his steward after the brothers. They have, or Benjamin has in his sack, the cup from Joseph. Unwittingly, they didn't know it. It was part of the trickery of Joseph. And then it is said I'll find it here, in verse 4, that the steward should say, "Why have you repaid good with evil?" And this is what the whole story is about. Joseph, because of God's intervention, has seen that the evil the brothers had done to him should be repaid with good. And the expression in chapter 50, verse 19 shows that very clearly. One of the accounts or stories in Genesis, which is often regarded as somewhat disturbing, is the strange story about Judah and Tama in chapter 38. Judah goes on his own socially. He marries, he gets children, and his oldest son is married to a woman named Tama. He dies. The second son is married to Tama. He dies too. Judah becomes afraid that the next will die too, so he refuses to take care of Tama as he should. Shortly told, she stands out on the road as a prostitute. Judah passes by, goes into her. She becomes pregnant, and then he hears she's pregnant. He decides she should be executed for her sin, for her crime, and he has left something with her. And now in verse 25 in 38, this is what he does. As she is being brought out, she sends a message to her father-in-law. I'm pregnant by the man who owns these. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. And Judah recognizes these as his possession. He acknowledges his sin. He lets her go free. And he turns from this point on to be a different person in Genesis. Now, in the previous chapter, the story is told how the brothers sold Joseph as a slave, not least on the initiative of Judah. And in the closing of that story, the brothers send the garment, a wonderful robe that Joseph had received. They send that dipped in blood to their father Jacob, and they tell him in verse 32 in chapter 37, they took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. Now, the expression here, examine it closely, hakerna in Hebrew, is exactly the same phrase that Tama is using when she sends the ring to Judah. Examine it closely and see. And when Judah hears those exactly same words, he is reminded of his crime. He acknowledges it is his fault. And now he takes responsibility towards his family, and he is a changed man. The last example I will bring out is not too often recognized, and that you may see of the many different translations. Let's turn to chapter 48, verse 7. Jacob, the aging patriarch, is retelling his life story to Pharaoh. As I was returning from Paddan, and the New International Version says, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan while we were still on the way, a little distance from Ephrat. The translation, to my sorrow, in this case from New International Version, is a compound expression. There is a verb, met, die, and there is a preposition, al, and then you have the first person pronoun for I. So it is said, died because of me. And certainly it created sorrow. This was the favorite wife of Jacob, his life's love. The expression met al has been used once earlier in Genesis. Let's go back to chapter 26, verse 9. In 26, verse 9, Isaac has brought his wife Rebekah to the land of the Philistines. And as he learned from his father, he pretended that Rebekah was his wife, was his sister, not his wife. When Abimelech discovers that, because he sees them kissing each other, he gets mad, and this is what we read in verse 9 and verse 9 of Genesis 26. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, she is really your wife. Why did you say she is my sister? Isaac answered him, because I thought I might lose my life on account of her. The expression used here is exactly the same as you find Jacob using about Rachel, that I might die, or she might die because of me. In Isaac's case, that I might die because of her. But the words, the verb and the preposition are identical. So here is a suggestion. Did Jacob believe that he was the cause of the death of his favorite wife? It could be. Her death is told in chapter 35 just after the renewed covenant with God, where he had asked all his household to bring their gods so that they could be destroyed. In that case, did Rachel deliver the house gods she had stolen from Laban? When that happened, Jacob, without knowing that it was Rachel, had said, and he had sworn, whoever stole Laban's house gods would die. And so she did. Well, I hope you have enjoyed these glimpses from the literary art of suggestion in Genesis. An extra tidbit. Welcome back as we conclude the regular tidbits from the book of Genesis. Thank you.